Hello my dear friends, you're in the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 24th of October of 2023. Today we have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. And as you know, the most important and the most interesting updates are coming from Avdiivka direction. Today, on the 24th of October, as a result of very fierce clashes, as a result of very heavy battles and very bloody battles, the Russians managed to establish control over the Terrikon. To be more precise, the Russians' 114th Brigade managed to capture this territory. This is DPR Brigade, this is ex-Ukrainians, we can call them like this, who was in 2014 and 2013 a part of Ukraine. These guys managed to capture this stronghold. That was a very heavy and bloody battle. So let's start from the beginning. The Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation reported that as a result of clashes on Donetsk direction, the Ukrainians lost during the previous 24 hours 235 soldiers, 6 armored vehicles and 6 artillery systems. Yesterday in the evening, somewhere at 11 p.m. of the local time, the Ukrainian sources started publishing the information that as a result of clashes, the Russians managed to establish control over the Terrikon and that the Russians managed to get the railways. So basically, according to the information that we got yesterday in the evening, the Russians have already established control and got this line. But by the 11 p.m. of the local time yesterday, we still didn't receive any geolocated proofs of that. Later, another mapper like Syriac confirmed that piece of news, and he also reported that the Russians managed to capture Terrikon and to get the railways. And today, just at 4 p.m. of the local time, the Ukrainian sources, basically this is something like a sources who connected with the soldiers on the ground, reported that the Russians managed to capture the Terrikon as a result of very fierce clashes and battles. At 12 a.m., at 4 p.m. of the local time, the Russians published the video of that operation, how the Russians were storming this territory, and that operation was very interesting, and there are a lot of very interesting details that I would like to point your attention. First of all, we need to understand that the Russians didn't attack and storm this territory using infantry or armored vehicles. The main job was done using the FPV drones. So the Russians started using new type of warfare, new type of tactics, and this is not for the first time. The first time the Russians used the same tactic was at the area on Kherson direction when the Ukrainians managed to capture trenches, and the Russians counterattacked and cleared the trenches using just FPV drones. So the Russians made the same thing when talking about Terrikon. Another important thing that we need to mention and they need to pay attention to is, let's take a look at these Ukrainian soldiers. Ukrainian soldiers who just evacuated and ran away from their shelters, maybe because of artillery fire or the Russians managed to drop some grenades. And if you take a look at these guys, you're gonna see that these are another Ukrainian flip-flops forces. These guys are not ready. They don't have weapon, they don't have munition, they don't have nothing. They are scared and afraid of the current situation. So basically the Russians are trying to say that that attack, that operation that the Russians managed to implement in Terrikon was unexpected for the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians were so sure for 100% that it's impossible to capture this territory, so they didn't even wear guns and munition. They didn't hold guns and munition with them. So that was a fantastic operation. The Ukrainians tried to run from one shelter to another. Everything was under very heavy fire of FPV drones, of missiles and so on. We see Russian flag and the flag of 114th Brigade, and basically the Ukrainians couldn't do anything with this. Just maybe in a few hours later they managed to get some weapon, but even though the Ukrainians were collapsed and defeated without even making any barriers for the Russians in this area. The question is, where is the Ukrainian forces? Where were the Ukrainian forces from chemical plant? Nobody knows. The Ukrainians lost the most important strategical area in Avdiivka direction. Of course, during the day, the Ukrainians were publishing some videos and geolocated photos and video confirmations how the Ukrainians managed to destroy a significant number of Russian armored vehicles and tanks. So they were, by all these videos, they were trying to maybe to show some balance, to show some progress of the Ukrainian side. Like, let's say they were trying to say, hey, take a look. Yes, the Russians managed to capture the Terrikon, but take a look how many armored vehicles and infantry we, the Ukrainians, managed to destroy as a result of clashes. So the loss of Terrikon equal the losses of Russian armored vehicles during the 24 hours. Of course, we understand that it is not like this. Terrikon has the strategical purpose, purpose, and we understand that the Russians can build and produce the number of armored vehicles they lost during the battle for Avdiivka, maybe in months, maybe in 2. And there are no problems of parts and supplying from the Western countries like Ukrainians have. So, furthermore, the Ukrainians during the day made few attempts to counterattack the Russians from Berdychi and Stepova. They sent lots of armored vehicles. They tried to establish positions along the railways in this area, and the Ukrainians were trying to counterattack the Russians from distance, but the Russians controlled the entire situation using the FPV drones, and as a result of FPV drone strikes, significant number of Ukrainian armored vehicles were destroyed in this area. So that attack was repelled by the Russians, and the Ukrainians had losses without any progress. They couldn't stop the Russian progress, let's call it like this. Furthermore, the Ukrainians launched some forces in direction of railways and a little bit to the south, and we got the video how the Ukrainian Bradleys were counterattacking the lost positions along this forest line. On this video we can see the Ukrainian Bradleys. This is the tree line, and we see that Ukrainians are trying to attack this area, which confirms the Russian progress and that Ukrainians managed to get very close to the Russian positions, but they couldn't retake them back. Also, the Russians published the video of FPV drone strike against another Ukrainian tanks who also came from the north, trying to attack the Russians from within a distance from the hidden positions, but those tanks also were destroyed as a result of FPV drone strike. And as you can see, the same FPV drone operators operated in the first and in the second case. So, as a result of Ukrainian attempts to counterattack, the Ukrainians were completely defeated and were forced to step back to the Ukrainian side of the railways. But this is not the only updates from Avdiivka direction. We got more updates, and the most important that probably during the previous 24 hours we got one of the most important update, and the value of that update, at least maybe for me, is even higher than the value of taking of Terrikon. We will discuss this update in a minute. But before that, let's take a look and let's discuss Terrikon one more time, and let's understand the value of this territory from this strategical hill. First of all, we need to understand that Terrikon was created, there are a lot of fortifications, underground facilities. We saw that in the previous video, but we need to understand that that destination or the site that those fortifications were created for is the northern and the eastern. And from these northern and the eastern positions, and probably the southern positions, the Ukrainians had possibilities to control the Russian movements in between Kamyanka, Krutaya Balka. The Ukrainians had possibilities to control the Russians in Veselye, Novosilovka Drugaya, and the Ukrainians could control the Russians in Krasnogorovka and let's call it like Novobakhmutovka. So all the fortifications were created on, let's say, the eastern side of Terrikon. And now the Russians captured this territory, and basically the Russians don't have like normal positions, normal fortifications, or control positions on the western part of Terrikon, because the Ukrainians didn't need them when they were on that hill. But this is not the problem, because currently the Russians have one benefit, at least one benefit. The Russians can control area that located on the south of Terrikon and of course on the west of Terrikon. And basically the Russians have possibilities to control everything that located on the right of this red line. And I expect that the Russians will intensify their actions and will start their offensive operation in this direction as well. And this is not like the main direction, this is not the main priority for the Russians. Basically, the Russians need to attack in this direction with one purpose: to slow down the Ukrainians, to stretch their forces, to make them not flexible anymore and not to allow them to operate with operational and strategical reserves. So this is like lots of points of pressure that Ukrainians need to repel, and that they need to keep some forces in this area. Furthermore, when talking about the southern direction, we haven't received nothing from this area, just one photo of fire anomaly in this area, and according to this picture, we can say that the Russians bombed the southern area as well. We don't have any geolocated, but we have just a photo from satellites of like fire areas. So as you can see, the southern part of Avdiivka is also under very heavy fire. Of course, we expect that the Russians will continue their offensive operation further on the Ukrainian side of the railways in the vicinity of Berdych and Stepovo, but today we got also one of the most important updates from Avdiivka direction that I talked a few minutes ago. And for these purposes, we need to take a look at this icon and at this area. The Ukrainian sources published the video how another Russian convoy with significant number of armored vehicles, just on this video we can calculate 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 armored vehicles were moving on the Ukrainian side of the railways. Yes, some of those armored vehicles got on the minefields and were destroyed, but the majority of those armored vehicles managed to survive and to bypass those minefields. And this is one of the most important updates. If we take a look at this map, we can project and we can speculate a little bit on the Russian movements. So basically, the Russians started their movement probably somewhere in the vicinity of Krasnogorovka, then they went to the north, then to the east, one more time to the north, and after that always to the west. Somewhere in this area the Russians managed to cross the railways and they started movements along this tree line. And somewhere in this area, one of the Russian armored vehicle got on mine and was destroyed. So basically, according to that confirmed geolocation that was published by the Ukrainians, the Russians, as a result of offensive operation, managed to cross the railways and currently are developing their offensive operation further in direction of these villages and settlements like Novokalinovo and in direction of the village or city by the name of Keramik. And this is one of the most important upgrades and updates and achievements of the Russians also on this direction as the taking control over Terrikon. So what is the purpose of this operation and why the Russians are trying to move to the north? First of all, the Russians are planning to establish control basically over this territory. And the main purpose of that, from one side, is to secure the Russian flanks, the Russian Avdiivka flank. This foothold will allow the Russians to continue their offensive operation in direction of the northern part of Avdiivka safely. The Ukrainians will not be able to counterattack the Russians. But the most important update, benefit that the Russians can achieve by taking control over the foothold between Novokalinovo and Krasnogorovka is the Ukrainian effective and active artillery region. Before the Russians launched their greatest offensive operation in direction of Avdiivka, before the Russians started Avdiivka News operation, the main Ukrainian artillery region, I'm talking about the area of concentration of Ukrainian artillery forces, was located in the area between Semyonovka, Orlovka, Tonenki, Lastachkina, Umanska. The Ukrainians moved their artillery system in this square, and from these positions the Ukrainians were bombing and attacking Avdiivka with cluster rounds, with 155mm shells, with multi-launch rocket systems. So they were terrorizing this area from these positions. And as soon as the Russians launched their attacks from the south and from the north, the Russians managed to reduce the distance between the Ukrainian artillery positions and the Russian edge positions on the south, of course, and of course on the north. And that common situation, forced the Ukrainians to redeploy their artillery systems from, let's say, these fields between, let's say, Pervomaiska and Avdiivka, and the Ukrainians were forced to redeploy their artillery positions further to the north in direction of the cities like Очеретино, Архангелька, Кераменко, Новокалиново. So in this area. And during the previous days, during the most active phase of Russian Northern Avdiivka operation, the Ukrainians were bombing and attacking the Russians exactly from these positions. Furthermore, the Russian sources are saying that after the beginning of Russian offensive operation in Avdiivka, the level of strikes and bombardments of Donetsk was reduced till minimal level since the beginning of the special military operation. And furthermore, the sources are saying that there were 3 days in a row when the Ukrainians didn't bomb Donetsk at all. And the people from this area don't remember these such days probably for for a very, very long period of time. So the thing is that Ukrainians were forced to redeploy their main artillery area to the north, into the secure area. But if the Russians are able to establish control over these, let's say, fields, over this foothold, this will force the Ukrainians to move their artillery region even further to the north in direction of Novoalexandrovka and so on. And this situation will allow not just reduce the number of shelling and bombardments of Avdiivka till zero, it will also secure the Russian forces on the northern flank of Avdiivka, and the Ukrainians will be out of artillery support at all. And those Ukrainians who located in Avdiivka, and those Ukrainians who located, let's say, on this part of Avdiivka, where I expect another Russian offensive attempt to attack, will have no support from the Ukrainian artillery systems, because they will be far, far away from the main combat line. Not because of they just want to be secure. They understand that if they get closer, they will be destroyed by the Russian FPV drones, by the Russians Lancet strikes, and so on. And about drones, one more time, I'll remind you that the Russians have created the 3rd generation of Geran drones. We saw Geran 1, Geran 2, the 2nd generation, and currently the Russians completed production and construction of Geran 3rd generation. This type of drone has the title of Italmas. It's much more powerful. It has less weight and has better equipment and heavy bombs. So the next period of special military operation, as I say, is going to be very interesting for the Ukrainians. One more time, as a result of clashes in this area, the Ukrainians lost 235 soldiers. Now we are moving further to Bakhmut Avdiivka direction. Today we got also a lot of updates from this territory, and the most important updates, of course, are coming from the areas between Bakhmut, Klishchevka and Andreevka. As we discussed in the previous video, the Ukrainians somehow managed to cross the railways, and as a result of offensive operation, the Ukrainians managed to establish control over the tree line that located on the Russian side of the railways. The Russians, of course, control the situation. Currently this area is in the gray zone, so we'll follow the situation. Also, today we got update that the Russians launched an offensive operation in Ivanovsky, but during the day we haven't received even a single confirmation that that attack was real, but not just something like an attempt to force the Ukrainians to stop or slow down or something like this. When talking about Kupiansk-Liman front lines, the Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation reported that as a result of very heavy clashes on Liman area, the Ukrainians lost 125 soldiers and 9 armored vehicles. Today we got the geolocation of edge Ukrainian positions on Tarskoye on Liman front line. On this video we can see how the Russians discovered the Ukrainian edge positions, and the Russians were heavy bombing this area with all types of weapons they have, with cluster rounds, with artillery bombs, with total flamethrower systems. Currently we don't know the level of loss of the Ukrainian forces, but at least one evacuation machine was destroyed and probably a significant number of infantry. The Ukrainians from their side made the same story. They were bombing and attacking the Russian positions with I don't know how to call this type of weapon, some light artillery system that can be moved by the, let's say, infantry. When talking about Kupiansk direction, we haven't received a lot of updates from this territory. We just got one geolocated confirmation of Russian positions. On this video we see like more details of the Russian attempt to attack on the east of Ivanovka. As a result of those strikes, of those attacks, the Russians used significant number of armored vehicles. A lot of tanks and armored vehicles were destroyed, and the Ukrainians are showing us the results of clashes, that some tanks were destroyed and more FPV drone strikes. Yet the Russians haven't managed to cross these, let's say, red line, but everything is ready for further offensive operation from Yahidna-Orlenka in direction of Ivanovka. We also expect the activation of clashes in this area within the next day. When talking about South Donetsk direction, nothing. Vremevka tactical bridgehead, we have already discussed the clashes in the vicinity of Peryutina. And when talking about Rabotina, we had a very interesting update that 47th Mechanized Brigade, as we discussed, was redeployed in direction of Avdiivka, and the sources are saying that this brigade has already lost its combat capabilities, not just in Rabotina. The rest of that brigade was reduced till zero in Avdiivka direction, and the sources are saying that since the creation of this brigade, up to 3,000 soldiers under the flags of this brigade were destroyed on the fields, on the battlefields of the special military operation. And I'll remind you that this is one of the most powerful and experienced and well-trained brigade that was prepared by the Western countries. When talking about this area, we don't have any updates. The only geolocation we have, the Ukrainian FPV drone strike against the Russian tank on the southern area between Rabotin and Verbova fields. This geolocation confirms that the Russians, as a result of counteroffensives in this area, managed to return a significant number of fields and to force the Ukrainians to step back deeper to the north between the fields of Rabotina and Verbova. Now we are moving to Kherson direction. The Russians reported that as a result of clashes in this area, the Ukrainians lost 55 soldiers and 3 armored vehicles. The Russians took a decision to create operational command, like tactical battalion group, like a fast reaction, a fast response, to prevent attempts in the future of Ukrainian, like forcing the Dnipro River and establishing the footholds on the Russian side of the river. So the Russians made necessary military adoptions, military things to prevent any attempt from the Ukrainian side in the future. Furthermore, the Russians continue bombing and attacking the city by the name of Berislav using Fab 500s, missiles like Ulmur and so on. Currently, the Russians are trying to do the same as they did before. They try to destroy the concentration of Ukrainian forces and not to allow them to concentrate and create a critical mass for further, like crossing the Dnieper River operations and so on. And another interesting updates, I would like to finish this video with Valery Zaluzhny, the commander-in-chief of the armed forces of Ukraine. We understand that he's in a very big trouble. Recently, he visited Avdiivka and he met the generals and officers. And according to information we have, Zaluzhny collected and met and had conversation with every single top general officer of Ukraine. And according to information we have, he ordered to stop any attack, any offensive operation all over the entire territory of Ukraine. He stopped offensive operation in Dnipro. He ordered to stop offensive operation in Zaporozhye, in Kupiansk, everywhere. He has just one purpose: not to allow the Russians to capture Avdiivka. Furthermore, Zelensky himself personally ordered Zaluzhny not to lose Avdiivka with any price. He can do whatever he likes, but not to lose Avdiivka. We understand, as we discussed in the previous videos, that Avdiivka is just the beginning. It's not the beginning of whatever we know. It's the beginning of the fall. And who lose the battle for Avdiivka will start falling down. And obviously this might be yet and the Russians and the Ukrainians. But as I understand, according to information we have, the Ukrainians are losing this battle. And so let's see what is going to be next. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds we condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel. Put your likes, join my Patreon. And have a good day. Bye bye.